Hello and welcome. Here's a shack. Let's just give Ishak a couple of seconds to get set up. Can I just check you can see that opening slide, Jane? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, hello and welcome.
Sorry, yes, I can, yeah, sorry.
No, that's grand, thank you. Hello and welcome. Please note that this session is being recorded to be hosted on the TEL YouTube channel. I'll put a link to the slides and to the mind map that we'll build together as well. They'll be linked in the YouTube description. I would ask that you leave your cameras on if you don't mind. And of course, if you don't mind appearing on the recording, it's just so that we know who's around when we have group discussions in a while. But if you feel more comfortable with your camera off, then leave it off. So we'll get going. Welcome to Show and Tell with the Centre for Technology Enhanced Learning at Lancaster University. Show and Tell is a recorded series of workshops with a specific focus on capacity building for doctoral researchers and early career researchers in TEL. You can see previous episodes on the Centre YouTube channel, so please do visit and subscribe if you haven't already. And you can see previous episodes there on things like theory, application, peer review, time management, academic writing, and lots more besides. This particular episode is on trustworthiness for qualitative research. Hopefully it'll last around about 90 minutes, I would have thought. I know some of us need to leave around then anyway, but I'm going to hang around and stop the recording if there's anything you want to raise unrecorded, so to speak. While we introduce things, I'm just going to ask if you've got any particular expectations, just type a comment into the chat, and then when we're doing some of the interactive stuff later, I'll go through those comments and try my best to meet those expectations, or at very least, I'll know what the gap is for a further workshop. The comments don't really need to be anything particularly well formulated. It's just to help me guide things as we progress. Just some advance notice too. There are a few, kind of conversations we'll have. Given the amount of people on the call, we'll just have them as a plenary. If there are, if more people do turn up, we'll maybe use some breakout rooms. But there are probably just the right number for us to just have a general chat about them, if that's okay. So you can see the scope that we're intending to cover on the slide there. I would like to say in all earnestness, if you do want to go in a different direction, do shout or type something onto the chat to say so. It's a workshop format rather than a prescriptive lecture or skills lesson or something like that. We'll have a comfort break as and when we need them, probably in around half hour or so. And then after that, we'll run through to the end. Unless you direct otherwise, we'll begin in a few minutes discussing why we're even concerned about trustworthiness, why trustworthiness might be an appropriate measure of the goodness of our research and the quality of our research. As scholars and researchers in TEL, we seem to be increasingly asking a lot of our readership. It's probably too much to just ask that they take our word for things that we're, writing. So we should probably discuss some means by which, goodness and quality of research can be assured in some way. So that's what we're going to talk about, really. After a small group activity, we'll discuss relating trustworthiness to ontological outlook and our epistemological perspective, along with methodological designs, and then we'll relate trustworthiness to different paradigms. Things that might be in competition when we set out to design and conduct and communicate our educational research. And then we'll talk about practical aspects of providing assurances of trustworthiness. And towards the end, we'll unpack and critique, how we provide assurances in writing, how we consider trustworthiness in data curation and analysis. We'll do that throughout as well. So the the point I'm making there, really, it's not just a concern for when we're editing and strengthening a paper, rather it's a concern that we can have from the point that we begin even thinking about research, really. There isn't some legally protected mechanism or language code at play with any of this. One of the things we have to acknowledge is how problematic and contested this is. It potentially calls to a dialectic of distance as well. What I mean by a dialectic of distance is that sometimes the closer we examine things, the less certain they seem to be. That can be enlightening and frustrating. So that's kind of what I mean by that. We're discussing trustworthiness in the research of TEL, so all of those things can be problematic. I think of the three things that we're discussing between trustworthiness, research, and TEL, I personally think TEL is probably the most problematic of those. I know research isn't exactly set in stone either, but if we can at least agree on some kind of conceptions of some of these things, then at least we'll have that shared understanding as we go forward. So let's just try and do that first, if that's okay. So if we take technology enhanced learning first, however we conceive of TEL, the next 90 minutes or so will probably only make sense if we consider of it as some kind of technology mediated social practice. So it's probably something that falls within the constructivist bit of the theoretical canon. So, not behaviorism, not cognitivism, something more related to social constructivism, something related to socio-material practice. But it's equally important. This is a little bit odd, but it's equally important that TEL isn't solely about learning. I think that relates to the evolution of TEL as a term rather than what's involved, but it's what Gert Biester might term learnification, where we end up framing absolutely everything about education in terms of learning, and there's so much more to TEL than the learning bit. So the point I'm going to make is, while learning is important, it isn't the only thing about education. It isn't the only thing about TEL. So, in this session, we can say TEL, and what we mean is, it could be teaching, it could be learning, it could be assessment, it could be learning support, pastoral care, resource management, media design, that kind of more broad stuff, really. I think the next slide will explain why, but we'll move on in a while. So before we proceed, let's pick apart a little bit about research as well, and that then leaves us free to discuss trustworthiness with at least some shared understanding of what research might be and what TEL might be. So if it's all right with you, I'd like us to agree that research, at least for the sake of the workshop, is conceived to be some activity that's kind of systematic and scholarly, and that's generating primary data about social practice of TEL in some way. So scholarly activity associated with knowledge production, essentially. So when we refer to research, it's not kind of market research or reading or describing tertiary data like academic databases. It's not pontificating or chatting about how rubbish things are. It's generating, curating, analyzing, communicating, related to new knowledge and understanding in some form. So if that's all right with you, hopefully that leaves us, sufficiently agreed to discuss trustworthiness. Is that okay? Has anyone got any objections? Grant. So in a short while, we'll have a chat for a few minutes. The question I wanted us to get things going with, really, I'm going to put up for us to discuss. It's a prompt for a conversation with a purpose. That's all, just something to chat about to get us going. And it relates to design in research of TEL. Just to clarify, though, what I mean by design, clearly there are aspects of design and redesign that take place throughout research, sometimes preparatory, sometimes iterative, sometimes reactive, and lots of other occasions for design. If we just refer to this typical process used in educational research, I think we'd agree that design and redesign takes place across all of these iterative stages. And I'd like us to focus on these three for the discussion. So identifying a problem, reviewing literature, and specifying a purpose for research. I'm not trying to be coercive, I promise you, but I just want to narrow us into broadly similar conceptions for the sake of that conversation with a shared purpose. So what I mean by preparatory design is the activity that we engage with in those first few stages. I've taken that from some relatively famous book, Creswell and Guetterman. The picture is from figure 1.2, sorry, it's quite early in the opening. In the book, it's a rectangular model if you're looking for it. But when we talk about preparatory design, if you wouldn't mind just sharing this conception with me, what we're talking about is things like specifying a problem, justifying it, suggesting the need to study for an audience who we're trying to reach, selecting a body of scholarship to review, positioning work against or amongst that backdrop of scholarship, and then beginning to formulate research questions. So that's what I mean when I write the prompt that's about to follow. We can discuss whatever you want to discuss, of course. All I'm really doing is trying to provide a canvas just to get us discussing some of these themes. So just have a think for a couple of minutes and then we'll go around the room and see if anyone's got anything to add. Here's the prompt I'm going to ask us to consider. I'm not going to put us into breakout rooms. I just didn't have time to change the slides. So at some point, hopefully, we'll be discussing what makes research good. What do we want from preparatory design? We might want to consider our own research. We might want to consider other people's. But what is it about the design of research that makes it good? What makes it about the design of research that makes it appropriate quality? What characteristics would such research have in terms of its preparatory design? So hopefully we can have a chat about some of those things just for a few minutes. I'll throw a shared whiteboard up, I think, and we'll do that. If we could go around the room, if you are able to put your cameras on and unmute, please do. If you're unable to, then please don't, and I won't come to you. So, any characteristics of goodness in preparatory design? Let's have a little chat. Did you have any thoughts, Jane, that you're willing to share?
Well, one of my thoughts was, and I don't know where it fits on the model, maybe in the first balloon, it's about trying to identify and engage appropriate stakeholders. So
Yeah.
people that are going to have some kind of interest or not in the problem, so that you're just not identifying a problem on your own and saying, I found this problem and I'm going to do this. No, you've got a much broader picture of what the issue might be and how it might be presenting with different groups of stakeholders. So doing some background and intervention and analysis to try to get something really clarified and stated, because just because you think something's a problem, it might not be. So
yeah, I suppose
it gives you a basis for moving towards the literature as well.
So in terms of stakeholders, we could probably split that up a bit. I suppose you mean participants, but others as well, right?
Yeah, it's almost at this stage, at the early stage, before you actually even start engaging research participants, it would be sort of exploring the kind of broader playing field of, who is likely to have an interest in this issue, because then I guess you can then go on to see, well, who else has looked at it and who have they engaged? So it's looking around in the wider environment, I think, really.
Yeah, I think any stakeholder model would have interest and influence, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And sometimes the different groups as well, I suppose, aren't there? People
And
with
you may
interest and people with
identify stakeholders who are potentially alongside you in your views, and stakeholders who are completely against you in your views, just not seeing it as an issue. So it's sort of trying to find that ground, really.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my first thought that came to mind.
No, that's grand. Thanks very much. I'll put gatekeepers on as well, because that's increasingly a concern for us, isn't
it? Shall I add a couple of comments? So I think with regard to TEL, you have to think of what the field often looks like. And it sees itself, as I think I argued maybe in that paper you cited of mine earlier, it sees itself as a service field where it takes problems that somebody else has specified. Some policymaker says, oh, I want an answer to so-and-so, or even an institutional decision maker. And if you take a kind of pragmatic stance, you will get people saying, oh, we should start from a problem. We should start even from a research question, as though it's a given thing from the world. And I think that needs a bit more problematization to be really trustworthy. In fact, it's often the case that I think TEL research isn't trusted by many other people in the scholarly community because it's seen as just offering tidy answers to questions that other people wanted, and furthermore often saying what the researcher thought they wanted to be said. So I think the first thing is to have an explicit justification for why this is a problem, and that probably has a few parts to it. The first is, do people experience it as a problem? The other is, to what extent has this been addressed in the literature? So I don't think that's, I know Cresswell and co have put this as a separate step, but I feel that that's a bit of an iterative sub-process of going from the reality to the literature and back again to refine which parts of the problem you're going to address, but also to kind of conceptualize the problem. I think often when people look at the literature, they're trying to narrow the problem down, which is a good thing to do. But sometimes conceptualizing the problem, maybe even theoretically, means that you recognize the problem is different, certainly bigger sometimes. I mean, think of a TEL project. Somebody will go, oh, I don't know, why isn't this interactive whiteboard doing what we expected it to do? And the implicit framing of that problem is about a tool. And you have to say, well, we need to know a lot more than, is that really a tool problem? Or is that a practice problem? Or is it a problem between several practices? And you can end up theorizing the situation and recognizing that the problem isn't what you first thought. So I think TEL research is maybe sometimes a bit too pragmatic in the sense of the kind of people, who prioritize mixed method research and philosophical pragmatism to underpin that, just taking problems off the shelf and trying to provide exact solutions without explicitly theorizing and justifying the problem. So in essence, I often don't start with just a problem. The first thing is to establish what the problem is and why it's worth researching and to talk about.
Just catch it up. Did you have anything, Natasha, anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I was thinking about reflecting on our own potential personal bias when we do research. And I think that's really important if we are talking about trustworthiness, right? Yeah. Because I think many times, and this is expected, and it's not surprising, we want to do research in our own context and the context of our own institutions. And also, I think many times in the context of TEL research, this is sometimes, to test something or to explore how certain interventions or models or technologies work, right? And I think there is sometimes, that there can be a presumption that certain things would or should work in certain ways. And I think this is something that we always need to reflect on in terms of kind of the research. We're not in our research, we are not trying to prove something that we think should be proven or evidenced, but we need to be open to be challenged on certain presumptions that we have. And that's where I think I see trustworthiness to play a big role in terms of how others can trust our research and our positionality. So it's also useful to talk about our own positionality in terms of our position in relation to the research, how we are involved in that research, what that means to us, what our approach to both theory and practice are. And I think that also links to some of the things that Brett was talking about in terms of theorizing the problem, because through theorizing and conceptualizing the problem, we can then also acknowledge that and open up ourselves to different possibilities and different avenues, for actually reaching that conclusion, reaching findings, reaching outcomes, etc. So basically, it's just being aware of our own positionality and our own potential bias in that sense, in terms of like what we are expecting and what we are hoping for potentially, and what the situation is and how actually best to research the situation rather than aim for particular outcomes, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Ishak's just written as well about us being kind of, I suppose, cognizant of the contributions, whether it's to policy or practice. Sorry, Bracken. I think you're John.
Yeah, I was going to build on. So we've had obviously somebody who can't talk because they're in a noisy environment and can't unmute, but I think there's some interesting points in the chat. So the first point made is about what it's contributing to, and so it's been written that should make contributions to policy development and everyday practices. I think it's worth having this said at the outset. I think that's a very good point for a project. What's its actual purpose? Now, my sense is that some policymakers need certain kinds of knowledge. Some practitioners need certain kinds of knowledge. There's also the fact that to be a research project, I would say it's aiming to contribute something to scholarly knowledge. And I think a project can definitely aspire to have those kind of multiple aims. You don't always achieve all of those aims in a single output. So a project might deliberately aim to make a policy brief and an academic paper and a presentation to local practitioners or other kind of engagement with practitioners, including, of course, engaging back with the participants at the end. So you need to be thinking in terms of what kind of knowledge are you producing and how is that going to be represented to the different stakeholders involved at the end, and realizing that's not just a problem to confront at the end and realize you haven't thought of it. You need to be kind of trying to think of that from the beginning. And then there's another point which is very interesting made, which is about not to be either optimistic or pessimistic regarding new technologies. And I think that TEL researchers are often perceived, I think in the past this used to be very justified as well. I think we're better now, or partially better, but TEL researchers used to be perceived as people who were trying to sell technology, as people who genuinely believed that technology would change the world for the better, or maybe more modestly would change some education system for the better. And then we're in this position of being constantly surprised when that failed to quite happen in the way that they'd imagined. And I think it's worth, I don't always like words like distance or something like that, because sometimes being an activist in research can be a really very positive thing. But to take a distance from whether you believe it's really working or not, your motivation could be that you want things to change for the better, but whether this technology is the solution, I think you can be a bit distanced from. So maybe the analogy there is with medical research. You know, you need to be genuinely distant about the fact that this intervention may or may not help the patients. What you're not is neutral about the fact that helping patients is good, right? So there's different kinds of distance going on there. And I think that TEL researchers in the past have often been seen as people who really were trying to sell the intervention. In this case, maybe trying to sell interactive whiteboards or trying to sell, you know, some website they've designed. And I think being very clear that you're not trying to do that is helpful. And on that basis, I really wish we'd see more papers in the literature that were documenting, you know, things that didn't work, things like that. I'm extremely respecting of researchers who publish things like that. It's probably some of the most valuable knowledge we have. So that's another form of trustworthiness, I guess.
Yeah, there are specialist journals which publish works that have failed, aren't there? It's fascinating. Well, that was all great. We'll certainly build on that as we go forward. What we'll do now, we'll talk about trustworthiness as a measure of goodness and quality, I guess. Excuse me. Otherwise, we'll potentially just get stuck at this point where some of us might actually be at now, where we have a, you know, maybe a legitimate question of why don't we just use terms like goodness and quality? Why do we have to use this notion of trustworthiness? In what way is that different than just making sure that, you know, we just do what we've just spoken about? I suppose one answer is that we don't need to use the notion of trustworthiness, but if we are going to reject it, then we can at least be informed of the alternatives and some of the risks of not caring. So I'll start to move us towards that if it's okay. Sorry, did I miss something there, Jane? Did you want to add something before we move on? You okay?
No, it's fine.
Super. So it is useful to understand the evolution of trustworthiness in qualitative research of TEL. There's a history of goodness being associated with scale, of course, where, you know, governments and funding bodies, and actually often institutional leaders in education, they'll perceive of good research as solely that which involves, you know, large-scale randomized control trials. It's very debated, of course, but what is clear in TEL is that positivist notions of good research probably aren't appropriate. They're certainly not always appropriate. So if we're accustomed to things like, you know, Cronbach's alpha and Pearson and Spearman and statistical validity and measures like that, which I know you're familiar with, Jane, they won't necessarily work with qualitative research with small groups. And the increase in take-up of qualitative research in the last few decades, I think it's fair to say it hasn't really been accompanied, at least on the same level, by conversations about quality and goodness. I mean, it doesn't help that there's that saw running through the research community about, you know, gold standard research, sensitivity, specificity, predictive values, and things like that. So we might have heard things like validity and reliability, perhaps more so if we've got a quantitative background, a positivist background, just to explain to people who might not have much experience of quantitative research. Validity is generally related to whether something does what it's supposed to do. And reliability is generally related to something being capable of being done again by somebody else and yielding similar results. They can actually go against the very intention of qualitatively meaningful research, where difference and deeply contextualized settings are often celebrated because they're important. So you can sense that in qualitative research, those two things, validity and reliability, they might be important notions. You can probably think of examples where qualitative researchers might want validity and reliability, but they'd be in different ways. And the problem is, in so many circumstances, we're actually interested in difference and divergence and outliers, and that doesn't mean that it jeopardizes goodness of research. So you know, sometimes we want to know how people think and how people feel and why that's different than, you know, what somebody else thinks and feels. Sometimes we deliberately set out to seek out difference and diversity of social activity and subjective opinions and what different people find to be qualitatively meaningful. It might be because it's surprising. or we might intend to research things that are problematic or antagonistic or troublesome. So sometimes it's more beneficial to use the notion of trustworthiness in qualitative research. There is a body of literature by people like Guber who will speak of trustworthiness to purposefully distance what they're doing from positivist interpretations of validity and reliability. There are actually some qualitative researchers who are happy to use terms called validity and reliability, and then they explain why it's different. But what I'm about to go through is different than that. It does set trustworthiness as something different from those positivist notions of validity and reliability. So that's why I kind of asked us to agree to those, even if it's temporarily, to agree to those notions of technology, enhanced learning and research at the start, really. So, we're not that concerned with central tendency and standard deviation and t-tests and chi-squared tests and things like that. But we still need to have some sense of goodness. Even post-positivists might build on validity and reliability, but they describe things like rigor and objectivity. Some of those words are quite charged, some are unhelpful, some just miss the point. And actually, if you've spoke to a critical theorist, they might discuss things like historical situatedness, and the erosion of ignorance would be a measure of goodness. So there's quite a lot of different notions of goodness going around, Let's first relate trustworthiness to ontology and epistemology. Ontology being our underpinning relationship with reality, and epistemology being our underpinning relationship with knowledge and understanding. So in a way, we've leapfrogged things a bit by agreeing right at the start to position ourselves in a constructivist mindset, even if that's temporary, but we'll revisit things a bit later. So these alternate origins and perspectives of goodness, they can be related to our ontological outlook and our epistemological perspectives. It does sometimes feel like, it probably feels like it as I'm speaking, that sometimes there's this serpentine parlor game of trying to explain trustworthiness without using a synonym or just defining something by what it's not rather than what it is. But hopefully you're getting a greater sense of this language code, what some of these terms mean to research and the scholarly community that we're part of. But you can see on there the criteria that might be associated. On the right, you can see the criteria that might be associated with good positivist research. On the left, you can see the things that we might consider good research from an interpretivist perspective, what an interpretivist would respond to in terms of goodness. These aspects of research, things like positivism and interpretivism, they're clearly based on our ontological outlook and epistemological perspective. So it might seem a bit mechanistic of me to put them in a table and draw a clean line between them. I don't mean to do that. I've actually extracted it from a paper by Brundrett and Rhodes, which you can see on the bottom there. My intention isn't to try to present them as clearly defined. It's just to kind of expose them, really, so that we can think about them and critique them and question them, and maybe pull on the threads when we consider the trustworthiness of our own research, and of course the trustworthiness of the research that we read, when we're positioning our own work amongst or against that backdrop of scholarship. It's as valid then as well. So you can see in that paper by Brundrett and Rhodes, if you wanted to go and read it, the aspects of trustworthiness are presented as criteria. Criteria is also a bit of a loaded word. But these criteria are conventionally presented with things like issues of ethics, roles of theory. So on each row in that paper, you'd see those different things being considered for positivist and interpretivist. And I've just dragged out the one for goodness, if you like. So what we do need to be careful of, I think, is treating things like this as a menu. As in things like we see these things in papers and think there's a really handy table. I'll pull that out as a menu, and I've obviously got some trustworthy research if I just use those buzzwords in my own work. There's also a risk. This is really complex to explain. I think it's easier to understand than it is to explain. There's a risk that we might pick something because it hasn't got certain weaknesses, rather than picking something because it has got certain strengths. Did that make any sense at all? Okay, good, thanks. And it's almost like we can lapse into an away from decision rather than a toward decision. So we might pick some kind of approach because it doesn't have this weakness, rather than celebrating it for its strengths. I'm sure there's a clearer way to explain that. Maybe you can help me a bit later. So having taken an appropriate approach to research in TEL, we then need to iteratively consider goodness amongst a lot of other things. And aspects of goodness can be met through trustworthiness. But I'm not convinced that we'd start with trustworthiness. I think, as we were saying earlier, we'd start with some problem and say, is this a problem for a lot of people, or is it just a local thing? What would the outcomes, what would the contributions be, and all that stuff? And then we'd work outwards, and we'd include trustworthiness and a lot of other things that we'd begin bringing into the problematization. Just before we do move on a little bit, if the more concrete and practical aspects of this still aren't landing, so if you're watching this later and thinking, I just want to know what this means at a practical level of designing and conducting research, well, we'll do that a bit later. We'll present a kind of, an operationalizable kind of list sort of thing, but it's also important to understand the underpinning stuff, I think. So if we turn from ontology and epistemology and look toward competing paradigms just for a while.
Phil,
This is sorry, go on.
Phil, Ishak has said in the chat that there's somebody trying to join the meeting and they can't get in. So I don't know whether you can let somebody in.
Do we see who it is?
I don't know. He doesn't say.
Hopefully we're not about to be Zoom bombed.
It says it's a friend of his, he says. So.
Oh, okay. So this is a similar arrangement. This time it's from a well-cited piece by Guber and Lincoln. This compares competing paradigms, and it's in Denzin and Lincoln's famous and massive handbook of qualitative research. It's in a chapter by Guber and Lincoln. So this issue column that you can see on the right there, goodness and quality criteria, that shows things that are compared across those four paradigms. And just like the last one, this is one of a series of rows. The other rows are things like the nature of knowledge, the aim of inquiry, and I've just cut out the specific row about goodness and quality. I should probably say, if you haven't seen this before, it probably is worth a look. As educational researchers and researchers in TEL, we can get drawn into our favored approach. I think that's fine. We have favored approaches. We have favored problems and favored settings and things like that. But just occasionally revisiting something like this, it's quite a nice reminder of what else is out there, to be frank. So over on the left, where we've got positivism and post-positivism, you can see there things like, rigor, validity, reliability, objectivity. For positivists and post-positivists, they'd be looking at stability, replicability, and the researcher's neutrality. And I think it was Brett was saying earlier that sometimes that's a good thing, but sometimes you want to celebrate the fact that you are involved in this, that you do, you have got some stake in it. You are genuinely and sincerely interested in what happens. So we can see in qualitative research that some of those things towards the left, they do grind against what we're trying to achieve in many ways. I need to be careful as well, right? Because I'm not trying to imply that all qualitative researchers of TEL can be put in some homogenous group box. Of course, we're not like that, but we're also united by certain characteristics. And you can see over on the right, as we'd expect, provide an assurance of goodness and quality. It's not going to work by talking about objectivity, for example, or validity, or reliability. So historically, two sets of criteria have been proposed for the goodness and qualitative. The goodness and quality of research conducted by someone who would be interested in a more social constructivist kind of paradigm. The first one is what we're discussing, which is trustworthiness, and we'll unpack that in a bit. it's trustworthiness is things like credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. And as I've been saying those words, you might be thinking, well, hold on, Phil, all you're doing there is you're trying to compensate for not being able to say validity and reliability. And I do find that, a bit of a challenge. And to be honest, it's that notion of paralleling positivist measures and feeling you have to compensate somehow that some qualitative researchers find all too problematic. And they instead adopt what's called authenticity criteria. I mean, that term itself, authenticity, that does loads of heavy lifting in research, doesn't it? It's kind of just thrown around. Well, authenticity criteria for goodness, they might include fairness. So how fair were we when we received data and thought about data and acted on data? There's also ontological authenticity, which means the research enlarges and extends personal constructions. And there's educative authenticity as well, which means the research leads to improved understandings of the constructions of other people who are involved. There are things like catalytic authenticity, which means it stimulates people to action. And there's I think tactical authenticity, which means it empowers people to take that action that they've been stimulated toward. But we're talking today about trustworthiness. So, the debate between trustworthiness and authenticity, it does rumble on, but we'll talk about trustworthiness today. I'd just like us to revisit the model we saw earlier again and look at the other half, if that's okay. Is everyone all right to keep going? Okay, grand. What we'll do then is we'll keep going and we'll just revisit that model and we'll have a look at the other half and just have a chat about it if it's all right. So in a short while, we'll have a little think and a chat again. And the question I'm going to ask is a prompt rather than a question. It relates to the conduct of Research of TEL. So just to clarify by conduct, I know I'm oversimplifying it again. What I mean really is data collection, analysis and evaluation. I'm not suggesting for a moment that all the other stuff on the other side of that diagram is not conduct. It's just so that we can all kind of move on with a conversation with a purpose really. So when I put the prompt up in a minute, what I mean by conduct is things like identifying participants, getting permission, engaging with participants, managing data, and analysing data and reporting on it, that kind of thing. If that's all right with you. So there's the prompt. We'll have a little think about that if it's okay. Can have a nice chat as well. And again, it might be our own research. It might be research that we're reading to position our work. And if it's okay, I'll put a whiteboard up again and we'll just have a little chat. So this time, goodness in conducting research rather than designing it, I suppose. Feel free to unmute and turn your cameras on if you wish to, or if you don't feel comfortable doing so, then don't. And feel free to drop some chat into the chat box. Okay, can I go to you this time first, Brett? Have you got any thoughts on goodness in conducting research?
I mean, I suppose I was still thinking about what you quite meant by conducting. So that's a typical answer to try and problematize the question. For me, I want to have a principled basis for designing the whole project. At a high level, I think people either go and dive straight into something very, very concrete, like designing instruments or approaching participants or even thinking pragmatically about what data is available, and kind of either miss out the step of thinking why the project has the type of design it has overall entirely, or they use something deliberately slippery like the case study, which as a word can hide a multitude of sins. That's not to say that all case study research is bad, because I don't think it is, and I've done it myself. but it's just to say that sometimes certain phrases are useful because they seem not to pin you down, and that's as dangerous as anything else. So you need a kind of principled basis from going from the things we talked about before, you know, your objectives, outcomes, the problem, who you're going to engage with, what kind of knowledge can be contributed, etc. You need a principled basis for moving from there to a project design, something that you could explain to others. And there's an odd thing here, which I think a lot of qualitative researchers wouldn't like. So I think there's a kind of fundamental distinction in research, which is perhaps even more fundamental than the distinction between quantitative and qualitative research and things like that, which is the distinction between the fixed and the flexible research design. And obviously, take your, you know, stereotype of a positivist, maybe a medical research project where you have to register your protocol first. Maybe it's a systematic literature review. Maybe it's the kind of thing where you're only allowed to use certain kinds of statistical tests if you said in advance what the hypotheses were, and all this kind of stuff. And then people kind of disparage that, and they say, well, you know, obviously in my kind of work, I don't want to do any such thing. And I think sometimes that's done a bit too quickly. And for the kind of work that I'm involved in, as you, Phil, will know, but just because other people might not. So we do these things called change laboratories, where you do design an entire intervention from the start. And I think there's a real advantage to having a detailed design of what is supposed to happen, in what order, and why, and maybe even showing that to other people. Not, though, because I'm still in the realm of flexible research, not so that that can be used to police things, but so that you've thought through everything first and then discussed it with other people. Even if you allow the possibility for change, you've then got that change documented. Whereas what I think happens in a lot of projects is people in flexible research projects is people use the flexibility as an excuse not to really think through design very clearly or in much detail or very explicitly or discuss it with others and all those kind of things, not to do those things, and then come up with a bulk of data and then just kind of justify something on the page afterwards that makes sense in light of the findings they want to claim at the end. So I think there's something about being explicit about research design where, horror of horrors, I'm going to say, you know, we can learn from these more positivistic fixed fields in terms of the fact that you need to think about this early in the labor of a research project, be explicit about it, and use, you know, documentation and things like that. I wish sometimes qualitative researchers would do that more.
Did you have anything to add there, Jane? You're on mute, Jane, if you speak.
Sorry, I'm out of practice. I agree with what Brett was saying there about, you know, having an overall design of what is supposed to happen whilst retaining a degree of flexibility. I think one thing for me in conducting research is understanding, making sense of my position as a researcher, so that, you know, I've obviously got, as a human being, a view on whatever it is that's being researched, and how do I actually, you know, stay out of the depths of that. And I, having done change lab research, I found that really difficult. It's really difficult not to get in there and put your own views and your own thoughts and your own opinions, because you're the researcher investigator in that particular methodology. So I think it's always difficult to know where how you become independent as a researcher of what's going on around you, especially when you get to, you know, start looking at the data. You know, you look at the data and find the bits that you like, and those are the bits that you want to kind of make something of, and all the rest of it, it's like, oh, well, never mind, you know, not to worry, they didn't really say that. So I think that's a really hard bit of conducting research. I don't have an answer for it. I think it's a very difficult issue. And I guess one way is to engage other colleagues to research alongside you, and to have to be part of a team of people rather than just you as a sole investigator. So yeah, my thought.
Yeah, and I think Ishak's written a bit about the participant related things there. I don't know if I think he's probably still unable to unmute.
And that's another thing, isn't it? It's about how you recruit those participants. You know, how do you decide? You put out a call for people to take part, or however you go about looking for them. How do you decide who gets in and who's left out?
Yeah.
You know, is it just the first come, first served, or do you have some kind of selection criteria, or what are those criteria? I think that's hugely difficult as well, to try and work out who best to include in your research.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds like a lovely problem to have, but it's actually really difficult to contend with, isn't it? This, catastrophic success where you might have to turn people away and still be able to be human about it.
And if you're researching in a reasonably kind of narrow field, then there's a whole other angle of you like to know quite a lot of people in that field, and they come forward as participants. It's like, oh right, okay, I know them quite well actually. It's that's also a challenge when you're trying to look for people.
Yeah, I'm just going to write a couple of things in as well, Jane, where Natasha's just written there about the importance of revisiting the literature and the scholarship as it's not a one-shot deal that we do at the start and things like that. And it doesn't kind of stop at the point we engage with field work, never to be revisited again. And the RQs as well, I suppose, revisiting those. Yeah.
That's an interesting one, because with my background from the sort of more quantitative stage originally, that was an absolute no-no to revisit the research question. Once you had the research question, you had to stick with that research question. And when it was suggested to me that I could change it as I went along, I was like, what? Because you can't do that.
Yeah, I must admit, in engineering, it just wouldn't even be a laughing matter. They'd say, "What do you mean you've changed the research questions?"
Yeah, absolutely.
It's funny, isn't it? And I suppose you might have a piece of research on your hands which it might have answered the research questions in a way you didn't foresee, but that again would be the value of it, maybe.
And I guess there's a question of trustworthiness there, isn't it? If you're going to endlessly change your research questions, or how trustworthy is that? If you started out in one place and you go into another place and another place, are you selecting along the way, or what are you doing? That's interesting. Anyway.
No, that's great. Thanks.
Can I just say, I think that the issue here is the very category of, discussing this against the backdrop of what seems to be qualitative research. So there's two issues here. First of all, a trivial one, but worth saying, is we shouldn't pretend that all TEL research is qualitative.
Yeah.
So, I mean, not all TEL research is qualitative. There's plenty of TEL research which is quantitative. And in fact, this varies around the world, of course, but we should also bear in mind, which is one reason why we need to be very explicit talking about these things, not all TEL research by any means is conducted in educational research departments. It can be conducted in computer science departments, engineering departments, business and management departments, psychology departments. In other countries, learning sciences kind of have their own departments, these kind of things. So there's a whole thing here of not imagining that a whole range of things don't exist and that we don't need to explore these things is not true. But the other thing is that not all qualitative research proceeds from anything like the same assumptions. So that's not a very, it's maybe a very broad category in itself. So some of the things I see written in the chat, they're really true, right? For some kinds of qualitative research, but not for others. So, what's good to be trustworthy on for a piece of phenomenography is not going to be the same as for a work that uses the change laboratory approach.
Yeah.
So that's why that's why I'm saying you need to be firm what the principles are. So for a work of phenomenography, it's really not done to give the participants too much structure or to expose too much about the mechanics of the research, because you're you're kind of polluting the potential for them to respond, and it's their responses that you're trying to resolve into an outcome space. I'm not a phenomenographer, but this is me hesitantly talking about this stuff. Whereas, you know, the kind of work I do with the change laboratory, the structure is almost everything. You know, the whole point is to think of what task design is going to get people to create new knowledge that they don't already know. So that's, you see, that's the difference. Phenomenography is trying to explore, I suppose, I perceive it as like a current perception, a current experience, or an experience of the recent past. Whereas this thing is trying to stimulate people, the change lab is trying to stimulate people collectively to generate knowledge they didn't already have when they came in the room earlier. You know, so the whole principles of what's right or wrong, and therefore what's trustworthy, is different. So I think you have to be clear what kind of research you're doing. And one of the things I get students to do sometimes is not to read the kind of books that you're citing on the slides by, you know, Goober and Lincoln and Benzin and I don't know, because they do talk very generically. And I say, you know, go and read a specific phenomenography paper around this or something like that. Now, the only issue with that can be, so everything you say has an immediate kind of whiplash problem hitting you around the back of the head, right? Is you can't talk then when communicating your research in such a way that everybody shares those views. So, you know, and also we shouldn't do this as general qualitative researchers. You can't just talk as though nobody else in the world is interested in replicability or something like that. So you have to first of all engage internally with what your own project's values are, and then you have to be prepared to communicate the data in such a way that anticipates likely objections. And I think it's quite a difficult terrain to navigate. What it means is you're never going to get to the stage where the knowledge is kind of closed. You know, those kind of, I suppose what I have in mind is this kind of idea of some of the statistical tests that are done by positivist researchers. Part of the reason to do that is almost to outsource the whole discussion of something like trustworthiness. We just accept as an epistemic community that it's trustworthy if this test meets this kind of range of numbers, right? Yeah. And I think it's a false premise to try to assume we can ever get to that kind of thing. What we're going to have to do is to just be really, really explicit at every stage in a very, very specific way and acknowledge that not everybody else shares our values. I think that's probably the only way you can go. So you might never end up with your bog standard checklist, you know, or if you do, that's almost going against the whole ethos of the enterprise.
Yeah. And Natasha's just commented there about, you know, kind of returning back to ontology and epistemology, and that what you've just been saying. So, what we'll try and do, if it's okay, having said that, we'll talk about aspects of trustworthiness that would generally be measured as some kind of reflective of goodness and quality, I suppose. I'm going to predict that for some people this will be your favorite bit, and for some people this will be your least favorite bit. We might even think that the rest of it up to here was the important stuff, or the rest of it up to here was the waste of time, and this is the bit that matters. So for some people, what I'm about to do is it will be a bit mechanistic. But like any kind of list or framework, we'll look at it together and then, you know, we'll smash it to pieces together as well. So if you wouldn't mind, that's what we'll do, whichever camp you fall into, and it might be another one entirely too. Hopefully we can engage critically and still contribute. This is a piece of work by Shenton from 2004. So before we start to talk about some of these things, it's worth asking ourselves a pointed question, I think, which is what's the unit of analysis? And that'll just help us along with everything else, you know. It's one of Brett's favorite questions, I think. What's the unit of analysis? And we can only make trustworthy claims of our research based on the unit of analysis. We can speculate and we can, you know, look at concretization and relating things to the wider social world and stuff like that. we can propose, policy practice implications, and we can speculate on implications more broadly, but we can only really understand that potential and the limitations based on our unit of analysis, I think. And our considerations of trustworthiness will help us to frame those claims. I do genuinely believe that. I suppose the important point to remember, which relates to what Brett was just saying, is that we don't really understand our readers' setting or the social group that they're working with, their own participants, their own context, their own constraints. But if we can provide the reader with trustworthy research and be open about our unit of analysis, our approach, our ontology, our epistemology, then we're enabling the reader to make a judgment of generalizability for themselves. Does that kind of make sense? So while we can't understand everything about their own place, what we can do is be open and trustworthy and let them at least have, sufficient knowledge to draw on to assess generalizability themselves. So there is a fairly established way of providing assurance. We wouldn't have a section of a manuscript that says trustworthiness and then, generate a list or something like that, would we? But trustworthiness involves establishing things that you can see on the slide there, and I'll go through a few of them. So credibility would be how confident the researcher is, how confident the reader can be in the researcher as well. Its credibility is established by understanding the researcher's motives, the background, how they sampled, did they have preconceived ideas, did they bracket things out, did they pick the mates, was it peer reviewed, did they critically reflect? I would recommend that paper by Shenton. It goes into a fair bit of detail if trustworthiness feels new to you. And clearly it is dependent on different theories and methodologies and problems, but there are some nice steers in that paper about credibility. Moving on to the next one, triangulation. I think people might associate triangulation solely with quantitative data, but it is important in qualitative research. It can be done through a few different ways. Data triangulation is, did we select participants from different social groups, different power positions in an organization, with other stakeholders at different points of production, people with different personal characteristics, or did we just pick our participants through convenience sampling? Do we discuss power relationships, constraints on capacity, distractions, time, settings, things like that? So that would be data triangulation. Investigator triangulation is, asking others to check our claims. Do we need to represent speculative findings to participants themselves? Are we clear about whether we analysed inductively or deductively or used a hybrid approach? How did we come up with codes, categories and themes, things like that? And I suppose as well, are we as people, are we members of a particular special interest group, a research centre, a department? Have we got professional ties or things like that? Theory triangulation, it's probably self-defining. It's the value of a good theory, that theory's pedigree and the style of research that we're doing. Is it established or is it something like a bit wild and wacky? And also checking that theory suits the intentions, our ontological outlook, again, epistemological perspective and methodology. So there's that sort of, commensurability, I suppose. Methodological triangulation is very similar. Is there alignment between theory and methods? Environmental triangulation might be things like the effects of days, time, spaces, settings, outside influences, things like that. Moving on a little bit to transferability. That's how qualitative researchers demonstrate that the findings are applicable to or inapplicable to similar situations, really, and populations and phenomena. So we can use detailed descriptions. I think Ishak wrote earlier about a thick description of the setting and the participants and things like that. Moving on again, confirmability is the degree of neutrality really in the study's findings. So are they based on participants' responses or are they based on the bias and personal motivations of the researcher? And sometimes you'll kind of drag out a bit of raw data, won't you, to just support any claims that you're making to help with that. Dependability is the extent that the study might be repeated by another researcher and would be consistent, not the same, but consistent. So all of those things can then be considered by the readership along with our open and honest descriptions of context and unit of analysis and temporality and all of that stuff. And then the reader themselves can judge the generalizability of our work. And I hope that what happens then is our own work becomes part of a corpus that other scholars will draw upon and position their own work against as well. So hopefully that's where we're heading with it. So our own work will feed other people's literature reviews and other people's positionality of their projects. Is that okay? Super. Right, I'm going to skip over the next slide. And we're just going to talk in a while about how we'd probably communicate things. So the communication and assurance of trustworthiness, it is dispersed. You know, it's probably obvious by now. We wouldn't have a dedicated section of a thesis called trustworthiness, but trustworthiness does run across how we kind of problematize and design and bound a unit of analysis and engage and sample and curate and analyze and read and write and make claims and all the other things we do as researchers and scholars. So on the left, I've just listed some aspects of trustworthiness that we've been discussing. And on the right, what we've got is just a conventional manuscript structure. And I suppose we do need to be careful because I don't want to give the impression that we only consider trustworthiness when we're writing and we've got to provide some evidence of something. But, you know, it is something that we consider in the preambles, the problematization, the design and all that stuff. But that said, to consider how we communicate trustworthiness, we can just spend a few minutes on this to close off really, and then we'll just go around the room and see if there's any final points. So what I'd just like to do is spend a few minutes considering how each of those aspects of trustworthiness might relate to a conventional manuscript and where we might find, you know, some kind of evidence that trustworthiness is assured really. So let's just imagine that the conventional manuscript is being written for, you know, empirical research of social practice in TEL, some kind of technology mediated teaching, learning, assessment, media design, learning technologist work, even designing, managing curricula. If we could just go around the room and maybe see if there are any thoughts about how these might be communicated. Is that okay?
Can I make or shall I open with a couple of comments? I mean, one of the things is research projects don't just produce one output. I mean, this definitely is a disciplinary difference as well, because some disciplines are very against salami slicing, things like that. Mm-hmm. But even where they do produce just one output, I'm often very, very almost harsh in pushing the point that a research paper is not a project report. Yeah. So you need to be very clear about the relationship between this paper and the wider project. Now, one way in which that could happen, but it's tricky, is Paul Trowler recommends for PhD students. So we're now talking about a PhD thesis, and this will become important in a minute, to almost have a data presentation chapter in which they give an overview of the range of data that this project generated. Not a dump, but a kind of overview of, you know, how much and what were the overall things, and, you know, a kind of report. Because the reality is, when you get into data analysis more precisely, you will end up inevitably drawing on a much narrower range of data, particularly for qualitative data. You end up making assertions and then kind of just giving what can appear to sometimes be cherry-picked examples, right? Which is the opposite of trustworthiness. If people think it's cherry-picking odd examples to back up the point that you want to make as a researcher, they're not trusting you at all. So now this is tricky because actually the very format and genre of a journal article has its internal contradictions. One side of the contradiction is you need to be making an argument, not reporting on a project. So therefore, we almost need to take part of a project's data, analyze it in a certain way. We've got a motivation. We're trying to contribute to knowledge, not just report, right? But the other side of it is we need this sense in which we've drawn on a range of data from this project, and we need some way of indicating how that's been done. And the data presentation chapter idea is a good one, but it probably takes a lot of words. Could you have a data presentation section? You probably could if the journal if the journal in question was allowing you to have the word count to do that. So one of the issues here, I know it doesn't fit into just one of the sections, one of the issues here is that the journal format in restricting word count so much, I think sometimes is a barrier to trustworthiness. If you have to prioritize, often trustworthiness and this kind of stuff falls just far enough down the list of writing priorities to get chopped.
Yeah.
Not that it's not important or that people hate it so much as there just isn't room for that, so this is a tension all the time, I think, is worth thinking about.
Yeah, thanks for that. Did you have any thoughts, Jane? I know you're probably writing some insightful stuff that Brett's just given us there, aren't you? Sorry to disturb you.
No, it's okay. I'm not entirely sure here. I think this was where it gets quite challenging, because all of those kind of aspects of trustworthiness that you mentioned and went through, feel I completely agree with. And they tend to get they're almost kind of dotted through your conventional manuscript. It's almost like at the end of it, you could get a piece of paper and draw a table and put, the aspects of trustworthiness in the sections across the top, and see that you've populated the whole table, that determine your trustworthiness. And I guess there's also a challenge of not over egging it, so not almost making it as though you've gone out of your way to ensure that you've got all this trustworthiness all the way through it. So I'm not entirely sure. I find this bit it's quite challenging to know.
Yeah, no, I think I'm with you, actually. I think if we were going to start, we wouldn't do it, would we? But if we were going to start drawing lines, we'd just end up with a big mash and muddle of lines running everywhere, wouldn't we? Yeah. And I think at that point, it probably is too mechanistic. It also implies, I suppose, that there's a fix for it, like a rec fix by having somebody sign off on your ethics, you've automatically got an ethical piece of research. Not the case. So there's no rec fix, there's no trustworthiness fix. It's another one of those things that we've got to contend with, I suppose.
And it's almost like you could use that language, credibility, transferability, all of this, but it still might not be that you've got a trustworthy piece. You can use the language. Just
you doing that word salad thing again, right?
I think it's really, really hard to kind of know. And I don't know, somehow this is probably completely unscientific, but you get a sort of gut feeling about stuff when you read stuff. You get more of a gut feeling of, this sounds like a really credible piece. It sounds like I can put some, that they knew what they were doing, that they've written it clearly, that I can understand it, rather than other stuff where you think, I haven't got a clue what they're trying to say, and I can't see how this is actually credible. And that's going to be different for every person as well, because we all have certain preferences. So it's wrought with difficulty.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to stop sharing this, and then we'll go to Brett, and I'll make sure I read your posts out, Ishak, so don't worry. Brett.
You wouldn't mind just sharing that again, would you, Phil? Because my comment was going to involve me reading down it while
yeah.
I was just going to look at, obviously, not every section is equally replete with trustworthiness. An example of something that's maybe not, despite what we said earlier, are the literature review, for example, because I think the literature review for a paper is not the same as a literature review for a project. The literature review for an empirical paper, especially, is just setting up the critique of the literature that this paper is going to contribute to, rather than everything I read in advance of this project.
Yeah.
But I'd expect the introduction to be clear about the motivation for the project. Why did the researcher want to do this work in this way? That would be one aspect of trustworthiness. Why was this considered to be a research problem? You know, had it not been studied in the literature, and also was it urgent in some context? Something like that gets me to, you know, warm to the paper more as a reader, just intuitively.
Yeah.
I would say the theoretical framework, I want to not just see that stated, although actually sometimes seeing the theoretical framework stated clearly is a big step forward from what we actually get. So that's a good start. But I'd like to hear about why it was chosen and how it actually informed the project at the various stages of the life cycle. So this is that kind of being explicit again. The research design, I'd like to still see the theoretical framework kind of present. You know, I'm talking about this principled basis for having a research design again, a kind of phrase I used earlier. And in the findings, some sort of explicit discussion of why certain data has been selected to be used, because obviously, unlike quantitative research, your data excerpts are not, you know, they don't cover everything in a single table or something like that. So you could literally say, maybe you can say in the research design section how you're going to select the data to be chosen, or in certain instances in the findings, you can explicitly say, you know, you can even say this is an example of someone who was an outlier. You know, this is somebody saying something that wasn't typical from what the other participants said, and I've chosen it for that reason. It's not that there's only one rule, but that you're explicit about it. I don't see discussion being particularly about trustworthiness because it pairs with the literature review. And then the conclusion needs a convincing discussion of limitations, which is not alien to the previous statement of epistemology and ontology, and just says, oh, you know, we could have done this with a bigger sample size, which is often not relevant given the statement of epistemology earlier. But the limitations are kind of what actually happened in this project, which impacted the real findings, you know, that actually had an impact, you know, not just trite limitations that really are getting you out of real reflection on what the limitations of this project were. So these are the kind of bits that I look for, that where I think this person's really engaged with the research process on a principled basis, and then is willing to communicate that authentically. I know we problematized that earlier, but authentically to a reader. Those are probably the key ways, you know, looking down your bullet points, you know, what I would look for. Otherwise, I'm starting to itch a little bit, not quite trust this research, you know?
Yeah. I mean, if I might ask you, as someone who's experienced at reading a lot of these things and forming a lot of judgments of trustworthiness, is it, you might not want to answer me, but is it something that you either have or don't have by, I don't know, by the time you may be a third the way through a piece of writing, or is it something that you're open to until you've finished? Is it first impressions last? What?
Honestly speaking, I would like to believe I'm open-minded enough to kind of keep my options open on making that judgment until the end of reading the paper. But I form preconceptions pretty quickly, and I'm rarely surprised. You know, somebody who doesn't talk in a certain way in the introduction also makes, you know, similar problems that I always find by the time of the conclusion. It's like people either, I can always make particular comments on particular sections, but it feels like somebody either gets this or they don't somehow. And so, yeah, honestly, I can tell it by, you know, by the start of page 2, I've already kind of got a strong inkling of what I'm likely to encounter in the rest of the paper.
Yeah, and you look like you agree there, Jane. You
I would
see a lot
agree
of
with Brett.
papers, don't you?
I would agree with Brett, actually, and sometimes I think I might even be less patient than him, because I might actually give up by a certain level if I thought it really wasn't hanging together. You know, sometimes I think, oh, I've got something else, I'll find the next thing, which is probably not the right thing to do. So I have to be strongly patient is the
Yeah.
word.
And would that be on a foundation of lack of trustworthiness?
Not totally lack of trustworthiness. I think sometimes it's also about the person's ability to actually communicate, which was something that you had a bit earlier. You know, that if I'm having to work really, really hard to try to understand what this person is trying to say, I guess part of me, which may be wrong, but part of me might start to say, are they trying to paint over things here, or you know, what's going on underneath here? And then
Yeah.
kind of got the patience and the time to pull it apart or not, you know, how critical it is that I stick with it.
We're only human, aren't we?
Yeah.
When we're reading.
Yeah, that's true. Anyway.
Ishak's put a nice post here. I think he agrees with what you're both saying. You know, things can be evident throughout the sections with a higher level of explicit narrative in research design. And he did post this before you mentioned it, Brett, about the word limit and paper layout might not allow for a detailed narrative of trustworthiness. I think we're going to clear things up now and maybe just go around, see if there's any final thoughts. I think people have got to get off. I know Brett certainly has. If you've got any final thoughts, Nerman and Ishak, please do put them in the chat and I'll read them out for people. But if not, don't worry too much. Any final thoughts, Brett, before we finish?
I think one way in which you can figure out how to communicate trustworthiness is to go and read other people's papers, and particularly read some critical papers. I think there's sometimes a danger in reading the Denzin and Lincoln book and then trying to apply it from first principles, as though, I don't know, it becomes slightly quixotic. You know, it's kind of in a way that never quite works with real world research. Yeah. So I think the best thing is to go and read other empirical papers and then try and critique them. How could they have been more trustworthy? And then form your own practical views on how you can do something similar to a paper that you like, or maybe slightly better than a paper that you had some reservations about. So I'm not saying, by the way, that the Denzin and Lincoln kind of books are not useful, because they can be useful, but they're the starting point for that process only. And I think there's another midpoint of empirical papers before you get to writing your own that's kind of important.
Yeah. Anything to top that, Jane?
Yeah, I think I agree, and also I think this has been really, really interesting, because it's raised a lot of points that sort of kind of do, but it's given me personally a much more sense of, I would now check more closely for, you know, how I'm doing this when I'm writing. So I found it really, really helpful, actually. I think it's a very complex issue. I don't think there are any answers. I think each of us has to kind of work with it from where we are and engage with other people in the discussions, which I think is, you know, as you say, it's great. So thanks, Phil. Really good. Really good.
No,
Shane, there wasn't more people. They missed a good thing.
It happens, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Grand. Hopefully now then we understand a bit more about how we become concerned with trustworthiness and why, and how trustworthiness is different from maybe more positivist notions of what good research is. But, you know, qualitative research is so diverse. Anyway, we spoke about the relationship between trustworthiness and ontological outlook and epistemological perspective. We discussed how notions of trustworthiness might be more appropriate for some paradigms rather than others. It's certainly not a panacea for good research, as Jane reminded us, but it seems like a decent framework, maybe as a reflexive tool to design, conduct, and communicate research. We looked at some conventional arrangements that, you know, might help us not just in exhibiting assurance, because that's risky as well, but also, you know, some key takeaways and some points for further examination there so that we can take it seriously. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If not, do let me know. For those of you watching on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe to the Centre channel. There'll be a link to the slides and the mind map in the YouTube description. So we'll see you soon for a show and tell at some point. And thanks again. Cheerio, everyone.
Thanks, Phil. Bye.
Bye.